Hi guys. So this is a follow-on video from my earlier video showing the first two watches I ever bought, both Citizen Eco drives. This is the third watch that I ever bought, and it's a Rotary Chronospeed. So for anyone who isn't familiar with Rotary, it's a brand that's very popular in the UK, and you'll find them in almost any retail watch shop, right alongside Accurist, Citizen and Seiko, as well as all the fashion brands. So I've had this watch for many years, and as you can see it has a few battle scars, most notably the loom pip on the bezel is missing, so I'll have to get that replaced at some point. But I wouldn't dream of losing this watch from my collection because of the long personal history with it. Now, I'll quickly explain some features of this watch that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, simply because they're nothing special. To start with, the build quality is perfectly acceptable for a watch like this, but it's no better than that. It feels solid, there's significant weight to it actually, but it's not anything that will excite you if you're familiar with, for example, the build quality of good Seiko pieces or certainly good Citizen pieces. As far as the bezel goes, like a lot of aluminium bezels on entry-level watches, this one does chip and scratch quite easily. Also, as I mentioned, the loom pip at the top of the bezel has come off, and I suspect that this might be a general design flaw because about half of the time when I see these watches for sale used on eBay, etc., the loom pip is missing from them. So having got the unremarkable features of this watch out of the way, let's move on to what I love about this watch. You might remember from my video about the two Citizen pieces that I said I bought them at the same time, and that at that time I didn't really know anything about watches. Even though I loved those watches, I didn't really start learning about watches in general until roughly a year later, and I bought this watch in the intervening time. So when I got this, which was probably only 4 months or so after getting those Citizen pieces, I still wasn't a serious watch enthusiast or aware of the different types of watches. So why did I buy this watch? Obviously the two Citizens that I showed aren't divers watches, and although at the time I wouldn't have known a diver's watch from a racing watch from a grandfather clock, just kidding about that part, I had seen divers watches in movies and so on, and I'd liked the look of them. So although I hadn't planned to buy a dive-style watch, or having done any research into why those watches looked the way they did, I was browsing in the same shop where I bought those two Citizens previously, and I noticed this piece just because of the characteristic bezel and circular indices that I recognised. Just as a quick note, I'm describing this as a dive-style watch rather than a diver's watch, because you couldn't get away with taking this diving. The main reason for this is that even though it does have many of the proper features of a diver's watch, for example, the bezel's unidirectional and it does have a screw-down crown, the water resistance isn't even specified. It just claims on the dial to be water resistant, which you should always take to mean perhaps splash proof. If it doesn't specify a particular, 5 ATM or something like that, then it's not a diver's watch, or at least you couldn't trust it to function as one. So it's absolutely for desk diving, and the diver's watch characteristics of it are for show and for aesthetics. So the second thing that really caught my attention about this watch was the overall dial design. And this is the main reason why I still love this watch today, even though I now have many real divers watches in my collection, as opposed to merely dive-style watches like this. Perhaps the first thing to note about the design is that it's much more original than many of Rotary's current designs. A lot of their current designs are, to varying degrees, homages to famous Swiss watches. So many Rotary Aquaspeeds, for example, are Omega Seamaster homages. There are Rolex Datejust homages and so on. But even though no one particular feature of this piece is unique, and many of them can be found in 90% of dive-style watches, such as the circular indices and so on, these features are put together in a distinct way, with its own character. Now, even more than the distinct nature of the design, what I like about the dial is that there's a retro-looking aspect to it that I love. Specifically, I'd say it reminds me of 70s watches. The colour scheme has a lot to do with this effect. I don't imagine that the 70s effect is intentional, let alone the colour of the loom used, but the colour of the loom does add to that effect. It's hard to say whether the colour is a pale yellow or a very pale green, but it certainly doesn't look like most modern types of loom, and it makes the watch look like a vintage piece. So you have the loom colour itself, which is unusual, and the contrast between the loom colour and the red in the tip of the second hand, in the lettering on the dial, and in the day window enhances the effect. And so do the sword-style hands, but the element that most contributes to the effect is the rectangular tip of the second hand, which isn't a contemporary-looking feature at all, and is very, very reminiscent of 70s watches. So the combination of this diver's style, which always makes a watch more noticeable anyway for obvious reasons of functionality, divers need to be able to see and read their watches clearly, and the slightly retro look of the watch add up to a lot of wrist presence. And this is probably one of the 2 or 3 watches I've owned that people have most noticed even from across the room. Now, although I clearly have a personal connection to this watch because I love the dial and I have that personal history with it, and it was one of my first pieces, I wouldn't have recommended it at its original retail price because, although I can't remember exactly what I paid for it, it was over the £100 mark, and you can obviously get, objectively speaking, much better entry-level watches for that price. So if you like the look of this watch, why would I actually recommend it to you now? The reason is, as far as I can tell, this watch is discontinued, but it's still incredibly easy to find online at great used prices. I mean, you can get them for well under £30. So at that price, as opposed to the original retail price, it is a great deal if the aesthetic appeals to you in the way that it does to me. So that wraps this video up. If you have any questions about this watch, or you want to share anything about Rotary, about your initial watch collecting experiences, or anything else that I've touched on in this video, then please comment down below, and please also like and subscribe if you found this video useful. Thanks guys, I'll see you in the next one.